Good morning, Lakeview. It's good to hear you excitedly greeting each other this morning. You can grab a seat if you haven't already. My name is Chandra. I'm on the pastoral staff team here at Lakeview. And this morning, we're going to just be continuing to look at God's story through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, specifically the book of Leviticus. We've been walking with God's people, Israel, and asking ourselves what we can learn alongside their story about our own story with God. This week, during one of our coffee breaks here as a staff, we were in the coffee room talking about movies and movie sequences, and we were debating what movies have sequels that are actually better than the first. And we decided that most sequels are typically not better than the first. They're a subpar version of the storyline, especially if there's a third movie. Now, I did run in and make a very good point that Terminator 2 is actually the best Terminator in the Terminator franchise. No one's a Terminator fan, hey? That's fine. Me and Arnie, we love each other. Anyways, you never need to watch that movie. But most franchises, the second movie or the sequel is not as good as the first, especially if there's a third, if it's a trilogy, because that middle movie, it doesn't really have a clear resolve. It starts in the middle of a journey and often just bridges to the end of the journey in the next movie. And it doesn't really have that result that you're craving as you watch it. And yet the information that's shared is so important. Because it's what's in the middle that helps what's at the end come to pass. It's the bridge that gets walked over to move towards the resolve of the conflict. It's where you get into the details of the resolution, where you get a full picture of what's actually needs to get done, and you kind of see the nitty-gritty of the journey. It exposes the problem, provides a plan of action, and points to the resolution. And it leads us to the end, which can sometimes feel like a new beginning, which is exactly where we come into the story today with God's people. If Exodus and Leviticus and the next book, Numbers, were a trilogy, then Leviticus is that bridge that we walk over to see how piece of the story ends. Over the last 2 weeks, we've walked through the story of Israel in Exodus. We've listened as Israel has been freed from being enslaved by the Egyptians, as God worked through their leader, Moses, miraculously delivering them to freedom. But freedom came with challenges, and they wandered in the wilderness, waiting to be let into this land that was promised to them, often actually longing for the land of slavery they just came from, because simply it just felt more certain than the alleged promised land that they were wandering towards. So God meets them in this discontented wandering, and he calls them back to himself. He wants to remind them of who they are, who they're created to be, whose they are, and what life outside of slavery can look like for them. He speaks to them and reminds them that he is a God who has freed them. He had a rescue plan of grace and deliverance, and that they can live in that identity, and they can also partner with God to share that identity with others. God speaks to Moses and gives him what we know as the 10 Commandments, 10 pieces of life framework that can lead them back to learning to be humans again after slavery and wandering. Instructions to remember who God is and who they are, the story that they're a part of, and that they're not just products to be used. That the values of Egypt will not rule over them, that they're not just valued for their productivity, that they can actually rest, they can Sabbath, they can honor each other, and that God has rescued them and will continue to rescue them and invite them to rescue others. So God instructs them to build the tabernacle, a place where God's presence will dwell and where they can meet with God. At the end of Exodus, we see the details of the tabernacle intricately laid out to have symbolism that matches the Garden of Eden, the place where God first placed humans in the story, a place where there was harmony between all of the relationships that humans had, with humans and God, humans and creation, humans amongst one another, and even in the relationship they had with themselves. The tabernacle represented a restored place of harmony, where God would meet with his people and where they could see him and themselves rightly, as he originally intended. But while Moses is away from his people meeting with God, the people get restless. And though they have seen the invisible God in action, they crave the familiarity of the type of God that they can conveniently see or shape into their liking. So they break the agreement, the covenant that they've made with God to be faithful to him as he is faithful to them. And they make a golden calf to worship, to fulfill their restlessness. And even though God has just commanded them not to create or bow down to an idol, and they agreed to it, here they are, caught in this broken promise. And so God declares that they're corrupt, they're stiff-necked, and he says that his anger burns against them. Exodus says that he wants to destroy them. That's how deep his anger was at their disobedience. But then Moses hashes it out with God on their behalf. He intercedes on their behalf, reminding God who his people are, that he delivered them for good works that he created them for. And it says that God relents his anger, does not bring disaster upon them, but says that they'll still experience consequences from their actions. So then he makes a new covenant with Moses that centers on reteaching his people how to worship, how to pay attention to God and reflect back to God who he is. He says he wants them to destroy their idols, the symbols that were capturing their current acts of worship, and reorient them to worship of God that was experienced through encountering his glory and his presence, and then actually living out the actions of his goodness. So Moses moves his people to constructing the tabernacle, the dwelling of the place of the Lord that will act as a conduit for these encounters with the presence of God. And as it's completed, Moses, who has represented the people of Israel, expects to be able to enter the tent of meeting, to meet with God as he has done before. But the end of Exodus says, then the cloud covered the tent of meeting and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it and the glory of the Lord had filled the tabernacle. Moses couldn't enter because he represented the people, and the people were still broken. They had chosen corruption. They had turned away from experiencing the goodness of God. And so their corruption made them incompatible with his presence. And so Moses could not enter. And this is where we enter into Leviticus. God's glory filling the tabernacle, designed to represent his original design of harmony and relationship with him and his people, but his people, his image bearers, rejecting the image they've been created in and having separation. And so again, the Israelites needed another rescue. This time not from slavery forced upon them from Egypt, but from the slavery of corruption and sin. So we ask the question, how is God going to reconcile this conflict of his holiness and goodness with the sinfulness and corruption of his people? And so Leviticus is the plan for a relationship to be repaired with God and his people, for a space of encountering God to be restored, and for his people to reform, to be a people who display his character and his goodness to all nations, that the world would see him through them. The bridge that they needed to walk over to move from problem to resolution, a manual for worshiping a holy God and living a holy life. Now, I must say, Leviticus is a weird book. Maybe some of you have read it. Maybe you've heard of it. Maybe you've flipped through it. Maybe you've perused through some of its chapters and verses and wonder why there needs to be so many instructions about if we touch mildew, or if we come into contact with bodily fluids, or whether or not you're supposed to get tattoos, which obviously I read the book after, just kidding. But I'm glad there's nothing in there about bare feet. That's all I'm saying. But truly, as you scroll through Leviticus, as you look at these words, it could have the potential to just feel like a mountain of do's and don'ts that earn Israel's way back to God's presence. A burden of rules that prove their faithfulness or are made to actually feel like holiness is unattainable. They can never do enough. It can be hard to see that the structures put forward are actually a framework for reconnection with God and with their true identity. And I get that. As someone who hasn't always been a fan of rules, I can feel claustrophobic thinking of a litany of guidelines that are placed upon the people of Israel in Leviticus. And my response would be to feel like this is impossible and to push back. And often when we are the ones that rules or guidelines are placed on, they can kind of feel like they don't make sense, or we don't always know why we're experiencing them. And honestly, most rules on their own without any context kind of don't make sense. Alone, they can just look like arbitrary directions. But when we zoom out, when we look at the context that they're given in, or the product that they're meant to achieve, or even the character of the one who is forming these for us, we see a different picture. Now, I learned this type of lesson in my early stages of being a parent. As you may know, Kirk, my husband, and I, our family came together through the foster care system 9 years ago. And all of a sudden, we found ourselves being parental units to 2 teenage boys quite rapidly. And we were very quickly fumbling our way through understanding what it looked like to create good structures in our home to support their growth. We found ourselves facing the first school break with them that we were just going to be at home. We weren't traveling anywhere or going to do anything. And all of a sudden we realized very quickly, oh no, if we're going to love each other at the end of this break, we have to set down some guidelines. Parents, caregivers, kids, maybe you guys have experienced the same thing. So there I was late at night, the day before school break started, scrambling to put together some guidelines for our life together for the next 2 weeks, so that at the end of it, we would still like each other. We'd still have good relationship, that we would feel like we are in harmony and not in disconnection, that there would be health amongst us. And some of these guidelines to anyone else or even any other time or anywhere else would seem strange, and yet for this time or for these purposes, they were really good. Oh, you'd like to hear some of them. I thought you'd never ask. Okay, so these are some of the guidelines I came up with. And remember, I had never been a parent to anyone before, let alone 2 teenage boys. So the rules were 1 a.m. bedtime every night, and they have to be awake by noon every day. There's an asterisk there with an appendices at the bottom. You're on your own for breakfast and lunch. You must eat more than just cereal, fruits, and or vegetables. And we'll work together for suppers. The dishwasher must be loaded every day, turned on if needed, unloaded as well as the dishes are done, and this must all be done before they go to bed. And there will be a few other chores throughout the week, but not too many. It was the break. I wanted them to chill. And you must shower at least every 72 hours, which for some of you, maybe that rule is still relevant. I don't know. And then, of course, we gave them the caveat that exceptions to these rules that work in their favor may be made at random by Kirk or myself, but they could not ask for them. We would just give them in our benevolence to them if we felt like they deserved it. Now, some of these rules might seem really random. For some of you, you might be like, oh my goodness, you let them sleep till 12. I don't know, maybe they're really specific or unhelpful if they were lived out forever. But if you zoom out, you realize that we were just parental units trying to figure out how to care for our kids' health, and while encouraging them to still enjoy their break and get to have differences in their rhythms compared to what they were used to. And we wanted our household to still coexist well at the end of it all. Now, I know that analogy doesn't line up perfectly with how God gives guidelines to his people, but we can apply a similar lens when we look at the book of Leviticus. It's not just a list of rules, it's a picture of a holy God who desperately wants to exist with his people and wants his people to exist in health and to flourish in holy life. And so he outlines a plan for reparation of that relationship through practices, through people, and through a call to purity that will set them on a path. As we look at this plan, let's just let the smart people at the Bible Project help us understand just a little bit more about God's holiness and what this pathway looks like through Leviticus.
Now remember, the story of the Bible began with humans in God's presence, but they were banished because of their rebellion. However, God wants to be in relationship with us, so he chooses one family that he will use to restore the world back into his presence.
And so God's presence comes to dwell in a tent right in the middle of Israel.
And that's great.
But it creates a problem because it's so intense that Moses can't go in, and other priests who enter inappropriately, they die.
Well, wait, if God's presence is good, how is it all of a sudden dangerous for people?
So think of it this way. God's presence is like the sun. It's pure power and goodness. And when something mortal and corruptible gets close to such pure power, it's destroyed. And so the word holiness is used in Leviticus to describe God's pure and powerful presence, which, like the sun, is both good and dangerous. So the point of Leviticus is to show how corrupt Israelites can live near God's goodness without being destroyed. Now, in the book, there are 3 ways for how this is all going to work out, and these are going to seem strange to you, but just hang in there with us.
The first one is rituals. The second is this idea of the priesthood. And the third is a bunch of purity laws.
Now, the book is broken up into 7 sections, and each solution is explored in 2 sections of the book. The rituals are here, the priests are here, and the purity laws go here.
Okay, so we're going to enter back in to understanding Leviticus with this structure. Now, God's presence is pure and powerful, good and dangerous, set apart from anything impure and evil. And his desire has always been to bring us into his holiness and be with his people. Leviticus 21:8 tells us that God says, I, the Lord, am holy, and I make you holy. So let's explore how Leviticus brings that to light. First, let's look at the rituals that God sets before his people. In the beginning of Leviticus, God outlines rituals for his people to keep, practices or habits that will weave into their lives and shape and form them. Some of these rituals were acts of faith, offering back to God what he had offered first to them. Others were ways to say, I'm sorry, or I'm thankful. These rituals were actions of offering specific things to God for specific reasons. Offerings of worship and atonement. Atone means to cover. And atonement is the reconciliation of God and people through the reparation or the covering of sins. Atonement was the acknowledgement that sin, actions outside of those that reflect God's image, have a cost of death. They bring about death either physically or metaphorically. An injury or a deficit that needs to be repaired or reconciled, or something that needs to be atoned. And so in the Torah, we see atonement, the cost of death in animal sacrifices, a death that takes the place of the cost of their sin. These sacrifices could not remove sin, only cover them. In the heart of the book, in chapter 16, is a practice called the Day of Atonement, where God asks them to have a day each year where the nation would confess their sins, and the high priest, their representative, would offer a sacrifice to cover their sins. In Leviticus 16, it says, Aaron will present his own bull as a sin offering to purify himself and his family, making them right with the Lord. Then he must take the 2 male goats and present them to the Lord at the entrance of the tabernacle. He is to cast sacred lots to determine which goat will be reserved as an offering to the Lord and which will carry the sins of the people into the wilderness of Azazel. Aaron will then present a sin offering, the goat chosen by lot for the Lord. The other goat, the scapegoat chosen by lot to be sent away, will be kept alive, standing before the Lord. When it is sent away to Azazel in the wilderness, the people will be purified and made right with the Lord. One goat whose blood covers sins, and on the other one, the sins of Israel are placed, and it's sent out into the wilderness, a sign that they would be able to be separated from sin. Leviticus begins with other offerings of atonement in other ways. Chapters 1-5 outline details of different kinds of offerings. Offerings to cover sins, show honor to God, express gratitude, or even compensate those who've been harmed. Giving up things like grain or herd or flock. Offering to God precious things to cover for the harm that's been done. Offerings of atonement to cover for sin and make up and restore. To show the gravity, the brokenness of sin and the impact it has, to render it serious, but to not allow it to conquer. At the end of Leviticus, God invites his people to different kinds of rituals. These are rituals that encompass rhythms of celebration, coming together around food and festivals to remember parts of their histories and remind themselves of their identity, who they are and who God has created them to be. God first reminds them of the rhythm of Sabbath, a day where they are worthy of rest that reminds them that they are not slaves to be used, but humans made to flourish. Feasts and festivals were marked to remember other significant events, like when God had spared them from death or released them from slavery or protected them from harm in the desert. These stories that mark their journey with the Lord and remind them that they are a people who have been freed by God's grace. Other feasts marked seasons changing, signified crops starting to grow or being harvested or new timelines. These feasts were times of community, set aside to rest and to be together, to enjoy, and to move forward, remembering where they've been. Both these rituals and these feasts, though very different in nature, have things in common. Each of them came with details and instructions that took time and intention and sacrifice. They needed to be prepared for and be given space that couldn't be flippant or haphazard. They were patterned with consistency that would anchor an entire community, offering space for reflection and reorientation time and time again. For Israel, these were practices that formed them into a people who understood how holy God was and how to remember the identity they had. Just like Curtis and Dallin were talking about, we've been talking about rhythms here at Lakeview a lot. What it looks like to intentionally place practices or rituals into our lives that anchor us as faithful followers of Jesus, that remind us of who God is, what he's done for us, and who we are. Practices that might say, I'm sorry, or thank you, or that bring us together in community to celebrate and remember. Practices that take time and intention and sacrifice, and that set us apart. As we look at our story alongside Israel's story, where may we need to have practices in our lives, rituals that remind us of who God is and who we are, that help us say, I'm sorry, or thank you? And how do we do that together? The next section that we see in Leviticus are qualifications and instructions for priests in Leviticus 8-10, as well as 21-22. Now, priests were those appointed to be mediators between God and Israel. In Exodus 19:6, it says that the Israelites were instructed to be a kingdom of priests, ideally that they would all be in holiness and want to relate to God. But as sin creeped into the world, the people needed mediators to help them find forgiveness and move back towards lives of holiness. And so priests were appointed. And they stood in the gap between God and people. They were full-time spiritual leaders and overseers of offerings and had the honor of performing many of the sacrifices. They were the ones who reconnected the disconnected. They made seen the gravity of God's holiness and became our invitation to live in response to it. And they were meant to be intermediaries that created a space where God and his people could be together. A holy space that could be accessible to God's people and encounter his presence. And they were faithful and diligent to model to God's people a way of holy living. A way was needed for God to connect to his people, and so he appointed priests. This was surely a high calling. It was not one for the faint of heart, as we saw in the video, because God's holiness was so good, but also dangerous. So priests had to cleanse and dedicate themselves before they could help people do the same, or God's holiness would consume them. These priests were part of God's plan for Israel at the time to reconnect to him, but we know that that plan did not stay the same way. That in Jesus, this imperfect priestly system was transformed. Hebrews 4:16 says that because of Jesus, who is our great high priest, we can come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy and we will find grace to help us when we need it the most. Jesus' life, death, and resurrection lead us to the presence of God through the grace of God that has been at work in the story since the very beginning of creation. A grace that doesn't require grain offerings any longer, but is offered freely and can transform us. And just as God told the Israelites in Exodus that they could be a priesthood, he also gives us believers now the identity, that same identity after Jesus came. Paul writes in 1 Peter 2:9-10, but you are a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, that you may declare the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his wonderful light. Once you were not a people, but now you are the people of God. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Those are our identities, and we are people who are called to be a priesthood, to be intermediaries between God and others, to be people who step into others' lives and help others see God's goodness and be reconciled to him. Though it may not be the same as the priests in Israel, that is our high calling, one that comes with intentionality and responsibility. We may not have to cleanse and do rituals to lead others in offering sacrifices, but we can live like we are called out of darkness into light and help others see the same. Help others know that they are part of the people of God and that they can receive mercy that does not make sense in a worldly way. We can be people who connect God to others and others to God. This fall, some of the young adults have been doing a Bible study on the U of S campus every Tuesday morning, and we recently read through Philippians. And there was a verse in Philippians 3 that talked about Paul saying, "Pattern your lives after mine." And that really challenged us. It was a sobering and kind of inviting question. Could we tell people to pattern our lives or their lives after ours? Could we actually tell people to watch how we live and tell them to do the same, and that would lead them to holy living? It was a great space to take necessary inventory of our position to connect others to God and the position that they could then be people who also connect others to God. As we find ourselves in the story of Israel, it's valuable to ask ourselves where we may need to have people in our lives that help connect us to God in more intentional ways, and how we could be those for others. Who are our lives patterned after? And could others pattern their lives after ours? The last section of Leviticus that we see are these purification laws, a call to both ritual purity and moral purity. Practices that lead to both inner transformation that then impacts our outer world. These laws were significant for holy living because many of them encountered the way of life that those around them that were not followers of God did not live in. They were different. They made God's people look different than others around them. It truly caused them to be set apart from the patterns of the people around them. There were two impurities that were addressed in these parts of Leviticus: ritual and moral. Ritual were things that happened periodically that required a cleansing or purification for health and well-being of individuals and the community. Unavoidable circumstances that had temporary consequences, like eating certain animals or having skin diseases or touching someone with a skin disease, encountering mold or mildew, or coming into contact with a dead body or bodily fluids. Things we don't normally talk about in our discipleship conversations around the dinner table after church. These things were not sinful or wrong, but they could cause unhealth in the community. Other than eating certain animals, the things that I listed were all symbolized as mortality issues, losses of life. They were literally symbols of death. And so God identifies them and he makes a way for them to be purified so that death can be replaced with life. These processes of purification often remove people from their community for a time, maybe even from their home, but it helped restore them to purity again. And it also allowed that to come into their community so that all would have health restored and protected. As we find our story along Israel's, what can we learn from a call to attentiveness of how their actions, our actions, could bring harmful results? Where may we be carrying symbols of death that prevent us from experiencing life that is truly life? And how may we need to cleanse those things in our lives? The moral purity practices were also practices that brought life from death, but in a much greater magnitude. They were practices that required an inner posture and belief that reframed perspectives and actions that breed death into perspective and actions that breed life. They were actions of liberation, much more costly and with significant impact on those who benefit. These practices were rooted in God's character of justice and mercy and liberation. They were guidelines for caring for the poor, making sure no one was overlooked. They were guidelines for radical generosity to those who were oppressed, and for sexual integrity that suggested that bodies held value and honor. There was a call for the land to have a Sabbath, suggesting that the land had value. It deserved a rest too. It deserved care. In Leviticus 25, there is a mandate for something called the year of Jubilee. Every 50 years that there would be a reset of the iniquities and the injustices that existed, that debts would be canceled and slaves would be set free, and all of the land that had been sold or taken would be returned to its original owners. That there would be a release of the excess, and those who didn't have would have, and those who had too much would have just enough. Now, it's not clear if those practices were followed, but I can imagine that if they were, that poverty, permanent poverty, would have been eradicated. Imagine that. Radical generosity that comes in like a wave and sets the marginalized free. Kingdom values that bring kingdom life. The parallels of these values do land close to home for us. As we look at our story alongside Israel's, we are challenged to recognize when we hold a belief that perpetuates oppression instead of liberation. How do we honor our earth and all that it provides to us? How do we view ownership of land? How do we honor our indigenous brothers and sisters as we dwell on land that they've stewarded? How do we view and value human bodies? Do we contribute to the objectification or exploitation of others? Do we protect and defend those whose bodies are vulnerable? How do we give them dignity? And how do we act in faith with radical generosity, freeing those who experience the oppression of poverty right here in our city? What happens in our hearts as we drive past where the lighthouse is or tents by the river? How do we reckon with the complexities of shelters that get placed in communities? How do we give of our time or our money or our resources in light of God's heart for mercy and justice for the poor? How do our hearts grow in compassion for those whose stories are not similar to our own? We're challenged to see the issues outlined in Leviticus in our current context and ask for kingdom perspective and trust that God's Spirit will move us. As this book ends and moves into the book of Numbers, we see the fruit of obedience to these things, of obeying God's pathway forward. Because in the beginning of Numbers, God speaks to Moses inside the tent. Where Moses was once unable to go, now he can enter God's presence. The new life that Israel entered into in Leviticus formed them into a new nation. God's solution worked. They've been transformed, renewed, restored, and with a great foreshadowing of what's to come. Because the way of life outlined in Leviticus is radically different than the other nations that were living around them, and it would have shown them a small glimpse of heaven. The way of the kingdom come down to earth, of holy living. A way that was fulfilled in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus. Jesus came to be the fulfillment of the covenants in the Torah between God and Israel, where Leviticus points us to the Israelites' pathway to restored relationship with God and a restored holy space with him in the tabernacle. Jesus actually becomes that pathway and says that we are all able to enter in. He embodies God's liberating justice and mercy as he heals those with diseases, spends time with those separated because of their social placement, and gives dignity to those who've been exploited. He sets us on a path to live the kingdom life. He gives us that same healing, that same dignity, and he says that this is for us and that he is for us. He expands the circle of who gets to be invited to discover the healing power of God's kingdom. In many ways, we're living in our own sequel. Life in a kingdom that is now and not yet, joining God in the renewal of all things now, and yet still waiting for the renewal that will come. And so we must ask ourselves some of these questions. What practices do we need to step into? Where may we need people to help connect us to God or to be those people for others? Where do we carry symbols of death that need to be replaced with life? How might we need to move from just religious rightness into right relatedness with people? How can our practices, our people, and our purity lead us and others into flourishing life?